Is the world's most powerful military alliance structurally fracturing right before our eyes? Or are we witnessing the brutal birth of a completely self-reliant European defense corps? Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Commute Commentary, where we look past the narrative to cut through regional bias. Today, we are diving into the multi-billion-dollar economic extortion fight that is pushing the West's ultimate security shield toward an official collapse before the weekend ends.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't just some standard political disagreement, The structural foundation of global security for, well, the last 70-plus years is undergoing this massive seismic stress test right now.
Right. It's a complete unspooling of these military and economic dependencies. And to really grasp the sheer weight of this moment, you have to picture the environment where this is all unfolding.
Oh, absolutely.
So for everyone listening, just set the scene in your mind. It's the first week of July 2026. We're in Ankara, Turkey.
Yeah.
And the city has essentially been locked down and transformed into this sprawling modern fortress.
A literal fortress.
Yes, exactly. Geopolitical reports indicate there are more than 70,000 police and gendarmerie officials actively holding the perimeter. I mean, they've got electronic jammers on every major intersection.
K-9 units sweeping everything around the clock.
Yeah, and major civilian transit arteries like the Batukent and Sudusu metro stations completely shut down.
Which is wild. The logistics required to host an event of this magnitude are just staggering. I mean, the host nation actually took a former military air base, the Timesgut base, which is just about 8 kilometers from the presidential complex, and entirely rebuilt it.
In just 7 months, right?
Yeah, just over 7 months. They poured concrete straight through the winter to expand the runway into a fully functioning diplomatic airport. And, you don't execute a massive engineering project like that just for a photo op.
No, you definitely don't.
You do it because standard civilian airports physically cannot handle the sheer tonnage of C-17 Globemasters flying in to drop off these armored diplomatic convoys.
Paving a runway for military cargo planes in 7 months is just a wild flex of state capacity.
It really is.
But it's not just the political heavyweights flying in. Parallel to this summit, there is this massive defense industry forum kicking off.
Right, all the contractors and CEOs.
Yeah, tech CEOs, military brass, all crowded into the same heavily fortified zone. So the mission of our deep dive today is to really map out the anatomy of this tense July 7th and 8th summit.
And we really need to look at how the core philosophy is shifting from, burden sharing to this much more aggressive idea of burden shifting.
What insiders are calling NATO 3.0.
Exactly, NATO 3.0. We're going to analyze the deep operational rifts caused by the recent U.S.-Israeli war with Iran.
And crucially, we'll examine the strategic leverage being deployed by all the major regional players, looking strictly at the tactical realities without taking any sides, as always.
Because that intense security footprint in Ankara, it's highly symbolic. It's physically shielding an alliance that is deeply and honestly, maybe irreparably fractured on the inside.
Well, the timeline of this collapse is just fascinating to me. If we rewind just a few months, this summit was supposed to be a massive victory lap.
Right, following up on last year's gathering at The Hague.
Exactly. This week in Ankara was designed to be this celebratory scorecard moment. Europe was finally going to show off the receipts, proving they had drastically raised their defense spending, finally meeting those long-standing obligations.
Because for over a decade, the primary friction point was always that Europe just wasn't paying its fair share for its own defense.
Yeah.
So this summit was meticulously planned to put that narrative to bed. But, that entire celebratory agenda just evaporated on February 28th.
That's right, when the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran was launched.
Exactly. The political and logistical fallout from that campaign has completely derailed this whole Ankara summit.
And the European perspective on this conflict is just rooted in this profound sense of operational shock.
Total shock.
According to international defense analysts, European capitals felt entirely blindsided. There was almost zero prior consultation before the Iran conflict started.
Which is a huge deal if you look at the legal architecture of the alliance. European nations view it strictly as a defensive pact localized to the Euro-Atlantic theater.
Right, it's a regional pact to them.
Yeah, so because they felt excluded from the decision-making for a conflict outside their borders, they pushed back aggressively.
And the pushback was immediate. It wasn't just strongly worded diplomatic cables either. Spain's prime minister outright refused to allow U.S. forces to operate from jointly utilized bases on Spanish soil.
They even blocked transit through Spanish airspace.
Right, and Italy immediately raised formal legal objections to the campaign, halting logistical support entirely.
Even the British government, which is historically, the most reliable node for U.S. force projection, they initially hesitated.
They really debated the legalities before eventually allowing access.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, eventually, but that initial hesitation speaks volumes. Think about the operational nightmare that creates for a military planner.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Right. Like, if Spain closes its airspace, a flight that needs to get from the UK into the Middle East suddenly has to skirt entirely around the Iberian Peninsula.
Which burns thousands of gallons of extra jet fuel.
Exactly. Which then requires mid-air refueling tankers to be deployed over the Mediterranean. It stretches the entire supply chain to its absolute breaking point.
Meanwhile, European capitals are terrified that a prolonged Middle Eastern war is going to suck vital resources like interceptor missiles and surveillance drones away from Europe right when they need a deterrent threat the most.
Which brings us directly to the perspective in Washington. Because reports indicate the U.S. views this lack of logistical support not just as a regional disagreement, but as a fundamental betrayal.
A betrayal of the underlying social contract of the alliance.
Precisely. From the Pentagon's perspective, the U.S. provides the ultimate nuclear umbrella, right, and the overwhelming majority of the conventional muscle.
So in exchange, they expect baseline diplomatic and logistical backing.
Exactly. When the U.S. engages globally, they expect their allies to at least facilitate the logistics. So the rhetoric coming out of Washington has stripped away all diplomatic pleasantries.
Oh, completely. The U.S. Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, was at a defense ministers meeting in Brussels recently, and he publicly called the refusal of base access by some European allies shameful.
Yeah, and he laid out a framework to implement a system of rewards and punishments based strictly on who provided support in the Middle East.
Which analysts are calling a multi-billion-dollar economic extortion fight. And wait, let me jump in here. That is their specific perspective. We do not endorse or validate that stance, but it shows how polarized the conversation has become.
It really is incredibly polarized, and the Pentagon is moving far beyond just tough rhetoric now. They are rapidly executing concrete operational drawdowns.
Yeah, they announced a highly accelerated 6-month review of the entire U.S. force posture in Europe.
And the potential reductions that defense analysts are mapping out right now are historically unprecedented. We're looking at the proposed removal of 5,000 troops from Germany over the next 6 to 12 months.
Wow. 5,000 troops.
Yeah, but it's not just boots on the ground. They are threatening to cut the number of F-16 and F-15 fighter jets assigned to the European theater by a third.
A third of the fighters. That's massive. And aren't they also looking at reducing the presence of strategic bombers by half?
Yep. They are threatening to withdraw a nuclear-capable missile submarine and a highly valuable aircraft carrier strike group.
Just pulling them from the pool of assets automatically assigned to the alliance in a crisis.
Exactly. They've even already canceled the planned deployment of a critical long-range fire battalion that was scheduled to arrive this year.
Okay, let me challenge the European perspective here for a second, because I think, for the listener, we need to upgrade the standard analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say you and I are roommates. I own the house, I pay the mortgage, and I spend an absolute fortune installing a state-of-the-art security system to keep us both safe.
Right, okay.
Then one night, I see someone breaking into my car, parked down the street. I ask you to toss me the keys or call the cops, and you just look at the lease and say, well, sorry, my obligations only cover the interior of the house. You're on your own.
Oh, man.
I mean, I would rip that security system out of the wall the very next morning. If Europe explicitly refuses to help the U.S. secure its interests in the Middle East, why should the U.S. keep a multi-billion-dollar carrier strike group parked off the coast of Italy?
Well, I mean, it's a very compelling way to frame the Washington mindset. If you view security as a global grid, the U.S. feels it owns the power station, and Europe is refusing to help maintain the transmission lines outside their own neighborhood.
Exactly.
However, the legal counter-argument from European capitals is that the lease agreement, the founding treaty itself, was explicitly designed to prevent European states from being dragged into foreign adventurism.
So they argue they are following the rules.
Right. They argue they're contributing within that specific legal framework. And honestly, despite the massive political friction, between 4,000 and 5,000 U.S. flights still managed to take off from European bases to support the Middle East operations.
Okay, so the infrastructure wasn't completely paralyzed. It was just highly restricted based on individual national sovereignty.
Correct. Furthermore, nations like the UK and France are actively leading a maritime coalition to secure commercial shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz.
But they are doing that under their own sovereign command, right? Not as a mandated alliance obligation.
Exactly. The core anxiety driving European behavior here is a concept military analysts call simultaneity.
Simultaneity, meaning everything happening at once.
Yeah, it's this stark realization that the U.S. military is finite. Attempting to manage major conflicts in the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe simultaneously will inevitably lead to critical shortages.
Oh, sure. So the moment the U.S. threatened to pull those F-15s and F-16s, European defense ministers realized their skies were suddenly looking incredibly naked.
And that sheer panic is the exact catalyst birthing this massive transition to NATO 3.0.
Because if the U.S. is threatening to take its security system down, Europe desperately needs to wire up its own.
Right, and this transition represents a total rewrite of the strategic doctrine. Washington is no longer asking for burden sharing, where Europe just chips in a bit more. The new operating principle is burden shifting.
Burden shifting. So they want Europe to take the absolute lead in its own conventional land, sea, and air defense.
Exactly. While the U.S. transitions to a strictly supporting role, primarily just maintaining the high-end nuclear deterrent.
And after decades of underinvestment, the capital's finally flooding into the system. The spending surge we're tracking right now is just staggering.
It really is. For years, the U.S. hammered Europe to hit the baseline benchmark of spending 2% of their GDP on defense.
And as of this summit in Ankara, every single European ally has finally hit that 2% floor.
But the panic over U.S. drawdowns has them pushing way further. The new stated goal is to allocate 3.5% of GDP for core defense by 2035.
With an additional 1.5% specifically earmarked for dual-use infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Like reinforced bridges and rail lines that can actually handle heavy armor.
Yeah, and when you convert those percentages into actual capital, you are looking at a historic rearmament phase. Recent financial disclosures show a $1.2 trillion total increase in defense spending from Canada and Europe since 2018.
$1.2 trillion. That's insane.
And in just the immediate aftermath of these recent geopolitical shocks, an extra $250 billion was suddenly injected into procurement budgets.
The individual national commitments totally rewrite the map of military power, too.
Sure.
Look at Germany, a country that has spent the last 80 years systematically avoiding militarization.
Yeah, they are currently utilizing massive debt financing mechanisms to execute a comprehensive rearmament program.
They are slated to spend over $150 billion by 2029. Let that sink in for you guys listening. By 2029, Germany alone will be spending as much on its military as France and the UK combined.
And then you look east to Poland.
Poland is aiming to spend an astonishing 5% of its GDP on defense. They're building one of the most formidable land armies in the hemisphere.
Even the Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're already operating at or above the 3.5% mark.
Right, and to facilitate this gold rush, the European Union has stepped in with new fiscal instruments, like the Rearm Europe Initiative and Safe Defense Loans,
which are designed to give member states the macroeconomic flexibility to absorb these massive hikes without instantly triggering a domestic financial crisis.
Or violating EU deficit rules, yeah. But wait, let me stop you there. I'm looking at these budgets. Germany's dropping $150 billion. Poland is at 5%. With literally trillions of dollars sloshing around, how can there be any anxiety in Ankara?
Well, it's not that simple.
Can't they just call up Airbus or BAE Systems or Rheinmetall and just buy whatever they need tomorrow? Why the absolute terror over a U.S. drawdown if they literally have the cash to replace the assets?
Because defense economics just totally defies the logic of traditional consumer markets. A massive infusion of capital doesn't alter the laws of physics or, manufacturing timelines.
Right. You can't just order an army on Amazon Prime.
Exactly. You cannot simply write a $100 billion check on a Tuesday and expect a fully integrated, combat-ready military to be delivered on a Friday. Developing, testing, procuring, and fielding high-end military technology requires years, often decades, of sustained industrial effort.
And right now, Europe is staring down the barrel of massive structural capability gaps.
Huge gaps.
Let's pop the hood on these capability gaps for a second. We aren't just talking about a shortage of infantry rifles or artillery shells, are we? This is about the foundational nervous system of a modern military.
Precisely. The most critical vulnerabilities are in highly specialized domains. Take ISR, for example, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
Think about the last time you tracked a package delivery on your phone. You take the GPS infrastructure totally for granted. Now imagine a European military trying to track a hypersonic ballistic missile launch, but they don't actually own the satellite network required to see it.
That is the exact reality. Europe critically lacks dedicated military satellite constellations for early warning and infrared detection.
Because for decades, they relied almost entirely on the U.S. Space Force and American airborne radar systems to see over the horizon.
Right, and if you cannot see a threat launching from thousands of miles away, your interceptor missiles are effectively useless. You can't just 3D print a geostationary satellite network.
It requires a decade of research, specialized clean room manufacturing, heavy lift rocket scheduling.
Exactly. Furthermore, Europe has severe shortfalls in long-range precision strike capabilities, comprehensive air and missile defense shields, and advanced electronic warfare.
This explains a timeline panic then. The U.S. is essentially saying, we are leaving, take over the security grid. And Europe is desperately responding. We finally have the funding, but it's going to take us 5 to 10 years to build the factories and launch the satellites. Please don't unplug your systems yet.
European planners were banking on a mutually agreed, structured transition decade. But because the Pentagon triggered a sudden 6-month forced posture review, driven by that friction over the Iran war, European capitals are terrified.
Terrified of a unilateral, immediate U.S. withdrawal that leaves their skies naked before their own industrial base can even spin up.
Which brings us to the most fiercely contested battleground of the entire summit. It's happening right on the floor of that defense industry forum in Ankara.
It is the fight over industrial intellectual property.
Right.
Because right now, Europe has trillions of dollars burning a hole in its pocket, but it lacks the domestic capacity to build the high-end gear. So where is all this new European defense money actually going?
It is flooding directly across the Atlantic. Last year alone, European nations spent roughly $54 billion purchasing defense industrial output straight from the United States.
That level of capital outflow is staggering. That's essentially European taxpayers directly subsidizing tens of thousands of American manufacturing and engineering jobs.
And the full order book for U.S. defense contractors from European clients is currently estimated at around $300 billion.
Wow.
The American defense industrial base is actually overstretched. They are struggling to scale up production lines fast enough to meet this massive, sudden wave of European demand.
But the geopolitical dynamic is shifting violently here. European defense ministries and domestic defense contractors are looking at hundreds of billions of dollars leaving their continent, and they are drawing a line in the sand.
Yeah, they are telling Washington we are done buying American weapons straight off the shelf.
They don't just want the physical hardware anymore, they want the intellectual property, they want the design authority. To put it simply for the listener, buying an off-the-shelf U.S. weapon system is like buying a locked smartphone. Sure, you can use it, but you don't own the operating system. You can't see the source code.
Right.
If you want to modify it or integrate it with a different radar or even just repair it locally, you have to ask Washington for permission. And if Washington decides to revoke your access, your multi-million-dollar missile system is suddenly a very expensive paperweight.
Yeah.
Europe wants to build its own operating system.
And the concept of design authority is the ultimate currency of military sovereignty. Whoever owns the blueprints controls the future of warfare.
Yeah.
So as Europe ramps up spending, they are demanding that production factories be built on European soil, employing European engineers, constructing systems that Europe fully controls without U.S. export restrictions attached.
The polite public-facing narrative in Ankara is that, the pie is big enough for everyone, that global defense spending is so high, both American and European firms will see record profits.
But beneath the diplomatic pleasantries, there is a fierce, zero-sum competition for technological dominance.
And the leverage Europe has right now is the U.S. manufacturing bottleneck. The U.S. administration is demanding prime contractors quadruple production of critical munitions. But supply chains for specialized components like microchips and forged rocket casings, they simply cannot scale that fast.
No, they can't. So Europe is leveraging this delay, essentially telling U.S. firms, if you can't deliver the hardware fast enough, license the IP to us, and we will tool up our own factories to build it ourselves.
This complex, multi-layered friction over finance, IP, and manufacturing timelines is what makes the geographical location of this summit absolutely critical.
Exactly. Turkey isn't just hosting this event to be polite. They are actively leveraging the tension between Brussels and Washington to cement their status as an indispensable geopolitical node.
Just picture the map of Europe and the Middle East for a second. Turkey is literally the physical and strategic bridge connecting the West to the world's most volatile regions. They are looking at the U.S. demand for burden shifting and Europe's desperate scramble for industrial capacity. And Ankara is basically raising its hand saying, we have the factories, we have the troops, you need us.
To understand the calculus in Ankara, you really have to look at President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's long-term strategic positioning.
Right.
Turkey has cultivated an incredibly robust, deeply sophisticated indigenous defense industry. I mean, consider a company like Aselsan.
The Turkish military electronics giant.
Yes. They recently achieved a market valuation, making it the 5th most valuable defense company in all of Europe.
And beyond the tech sector, Turkey commands the second largest standing land army in the entire alliance, trailing only the United States.
They aren't just a political player, they're a massive military powerhouse with recent extensive combat experience in drone warfare and mechanized operations.
Yet despite that undeniable hard power, Ankara harbors this deep-seated strategic anxiety about being marginalized.
Oh, definitely. As the European Union attempts to build its independent NATO 3.0 architecture, they are funneling investments into EU-centric security frameworks, like the Security Action for Europe or the SAFE program.
However, several core EU member states have persistently blocked Turkey, which obviously is not an EU member state, from freely integrating into these lucrative R&D programs.
You can see why that is incredibly aggravating for Ankara.
Completely. They have the active production lines, they have the battle-tested troops holding the southern flank, yet they feel they are being systematically locked out of the European club's new financial architecture.
Precisely. Therefore, Ankara is utilizing this summit to forcefully demonstrate their irreplaceable value. The message is clear. You cannot construct a credible, self-reliant European defense corps without integrating Turkish military capabilities and Turkish industrial output.
Reports say there are over 3,000 Turkish defense companies actively supplying components to the broader alliance supply chain.
It's massive. Turkey is executing a masterclass in geopolitical balancing here. They are acting as a critical mediator in the Black Sea regarding the ongoing conflict involving Ukraine, while simultaneously navigating intense security interests across the Middle East.
But there is another highly pragmatic layer to Turkey's master plan here, and it's purely economic.
Ah, you are referring to the macroeconomic stabilization efforts.
I am. Financial analysts and geopolitical strategists are tracking intense background negotiations, suggesting Turkey is utilizing the summit to secure a highly coveted dollar swap line from the U.S. Federal Reserve.
Let's explain the mechanics of a dollar swap line for a second, because it sounds like abstract financial jargon, but it's a lifeline.
Absolutely, go ahead.
When a country's domestic currency is facing extreme inflationary pressure, like the Turkish lira has, investors start pulling their money out. A swap line is a mechanism where the U.S. Federal Reserve essentially agrees to temporarily trade U.S. dollars for the foreign country's currency.
It injects a massive wave of dollar liquidity into their central bank, which instantly stabilizes their financial markets. It's essentially the U.S. offering an economic life raft.
And securing that life raft is a paramount priority for policymakers in Ankara, particularly as they look toward their next domestic election cycle. So by executing a flawless summit, ensuring the attendance of the U.S. president, and positioning themselves as the only viable bridge between a panicked Europe and a frustrated America.
Turkey is leveraging diplomatic prestige to secure vital economic concessions.
Exactly. It's an intricate web of leverage.
Yeah.
Every single nation is bringing a highly specific transactional calculus to the table in Ankara.
And that transactional nature is incredibly obvious when you look closely at the guest list. This isn't just a closed-door meeting for the traditional 32 member states. Ankara has strategically brought the outsiders into the room.
The inclusion of critical non-member states completely redefines the scope of the summit. It illustrates how the traditional Cold War-era geographic boundaries of the alliance are just obsolete.
Right. You simply cannot isolate European territorial defense from the energy markets of the Caucasus or decouple transatlantic security from proxy networks in the Middle East.
So let's examine the most prominent non-member at the table, Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky has flown into Ankara with a deeply urgent existential agenda.
Because Ukraine is locked in a grinding, brutal war of attrition.
Yeah, and while they have demonstrated significant tactical ingenuity, particularly utilizing long-range drone networks to systematically dismantle Russian logistics hubs and energy infrastructure deep behind the front lines, they are facing a catastrophic shortfall in localized air and ballistic missile defense.
Because Russia is heavily intensifying its barrage of strikes on Kyiv and critical energy grid nodes.
And when we talk about energy grid nodes, we're talking about massive industrial transformers. If those are destroyed, the civilian population freezes in the winter, and the defense factories literally stop running.
So Zelensky is in Ankara to secure the capital required to keep the lights on and the missiles flying. Reports indicate negotiators are finalizing a massive €140 billion financial package.
That €140 billion figure is staggering. But it represents a complex amalgamation of funding streams. It combines $30 billion in previously allocated macroeconomic support from the European Union with a new $40 billion direct military commitment from the broader alliance.
Structured to be dispersed over a 2-year operational window.
Right. However, the sheer total of the capital is honestly less interesting than the specific mechanism being used to deploy it.
Exactly. The money alone doesn't intercept a missile. This brings us to the PURL initiative, which might be one of the most clever, bureaucratic workarounds of the entire conflict.
Yeah.
How does PURL actually function on the ground?
The PURL initiative is an operational bridge designed to solve the industrial friction we discussed earlier. Europe has the political will to fund Ukraine, but as we established, they lack the immediate factory capacity to build the high-end interceptors. The U.S. has the manufacturing capacity, or at least the existing stockpiles, but is facing deep domestic political resistance to funding the war.
So under PURL, European allies essentially utilize their newly expanded defense budgets to purchase U.S.-manufactured weapon systems, which are then transferred directly to the Ukrainian front lines.
It's a perfect transactional triangle. Europe writes the check to appease U.S. demands for burden shifting. The U.S. defense industry gets the capital injection to expand its production lines without asking American taxpayers, and Ukraine gets the immediate delivery of Patriot missile interceptors to defend its grid.
It temporarily bypasses the European industrial bottleneck.
Yeah. But Ukraine is far from the only vital non-member asserting leverage in Ankara. If we pivot our focus to the southern flank, the guest list reveals an entirely different geopolitical narrative driven by raw energy economics.
We absolutely have to look at the VIP treatment being given to Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev. His presence in Ankara is deeply physically tied to the survival of the European economy.
Because when Europe made the strategic decision to aggressively decouple from the Russian natural gas grid, they had to find replacement volume immediately to prevent total industrial collapse.
And Azerbaijan stepped into that void, becoming one of the most critical alternative energy providers for the West.
The physical manifestation of that leverage is the Southern Gas Corridor. This is a massive pipeline network that physically bypasses Russian territory, transporting gas from the Caspian Sea through the Caucasus and Turkey directly into the European grid.
Securing that specific infrastructure and maintaining political stability in Baku has transitioned from a peripheral foreign policy goal to an absolute core strategic necessity.
And the fact that Aliyev is being courted in Ankara really highlights Turkey's immense power as the primary conduit, both physically and diplomatically, between Azerbaijan's energy reserves and European consumers.
We are also seeing high-level representatives from the Gulf states in attendance at the summit.
The Gulf state presence is essential context for the broader instability triggered by the Iran war. The alliance requires continuous, high-fidelity intelligence sharing regarding the movement of weapons and funds through proxy networks stretching from Yemen to the Levant.
And Turkey has successfully positioned itself as the most credible, functioning diplomatic bridge between the traditional North Atlantic powers and the Gulf Cooperation Council.
When you lay it all out like this, the sheer density of the dependencies is just mind-boggling.
It really is. I mean, the United States needs European airspace and bases for global force projection. Europe is utterly dependent on the U.S. for high-end technology, satellite architecture, and the nuclear umbrella.
Ukraine's survival relies on European money buying American hardware.
And the entire industrial base of all three relies on Azerbaijan for energy and the Gulf states for economic stability.
And sitting right at the nexus of all these intersecting vulnerabilities, controlling the physical choke points and hosting the negotiations, is Turkey.
However, to achieve a comprehensive understanding of the Ankara Summit, we must shift our perspective to the one major global power that is intentionally excluded from the room.
Right, the one scrutinizing every single leaked document, handshake, and press conference with intense focus.
We have to examine the Russian perspective. To maintain our absolute neutrality and present the full geopolitical board for you listening, we need to analyze how Moscow is interpreting this gathering.
According to geopolitical analysts and behavioral assessments, President Vladimir Putin's primary strategic objective regarding the summit is the structural fragmentation of the alliance.
Moscow is acutely, intimately aware of the deep transatlantic friction.
Oh, they're tracking all of it. The European anger over the Iran war, the bitter internal disputes over intellectual property, and the explicit U.S. threats to withdraw highly capable assets like aircraft carriers and F-35 squadrons.
Reports indicate that the Kremlin views these internal divisions not just as temporary political theater, but as a permanent, systemic cracking of the alliance.
If Washington actually follows through and pulls its strategic bombers and nuclear submarines out of the European theater simply because they are angry about base access in Spain and Italy, Moscow registers that as a generational strategic victory.
Achieved without firing a single shot at the alliance itself.
This specific calculus explains the recent tactical shifts on the battlefield, too. It is why Russia is currently intensifying its ballistic and drone strikes on Kiev and western Ukrainian logistics hubs.
Because Moscow calculates that European capitals have been the primary diplomatic engine keeping the U.S. administration engaged in the conflict.
Exactly. By applying maximum kinetic pressure right now, Russia aims to exploit the anxiety in Ankara. They are betting that the staggering financial cost of the war, combined with the bitter transatlantic infighting over technology transfers and troop levels, will finally snap the political will required to sustain Western support.
They are essentially watching the roommates engage in a brutal screaming match over who owns the house and who pays the utility bill, and they are throwing rocks through the window, hoping the stress causes the roommates to finally evict each other.
It is a strategy of attrition applied not just to the military front lines, but to the political cohesion of the alliance itself.
Because if the member states are entirely consumed by an economic extortion fight over intellectual property rights and regional base access, they are fundamentally incapable of presenting a unified, credible deterrent posture.
Which brings us to the ultimate underlying stakes of this entire deep dive.
Yeah. We've spent this time unpacking trillions of dollars in defense procurement, the logistical realities of troop drawdowns, the fight over military source code, and the intricate balancing act being performed by Turkey and Azerbaijan.
But you might be wondering how this abstract geopolitical maneuvering actually impacts your daily reality.
Right. Why should you care about the tone of a diplomatic dispute in a fortified room in Ankara?
Because the decisions being finalized in that room dictate the macroeconomic reality of the next decade.
The outcome of the intellectual property fight determines the future of the global technology supply chain.
It decides whether aerospace, cyber, and defense conglomerates collaborate seamlessly across the Atlantic, or if they fracture into competing, siloed, highly protectionist industries that disrupt global trade.
Ultimately, the Ankara Summit is determining whether the global economy remains relatively interconnected under a shared security umbrella, or if we are rapidly accelerating toward a violently decoupled, fragmented world order where regional powers have to fend entirely for themselves.
And it leaves us with a truly fascinating, almost paradoxical strategic question to ponder as we watch this play out.
We are currently witnessing the United States applying maximum diplomatic and economic pressure, effectively forcing Europe to spend trillions of dollars to construct its own entirely independent NATO 3.0 military apparatus.
But think about the long-term consequence of that success. If Washington actually achieves its goal, if they force Europe to become a fully self-reliant military superpower that controls its own satellites, builds its own stealth fighters, and no longer relies on American troops for survival.
Does that actually make the United States structurally safer? Or does it permanently, irreversibly remove American diplomatic leverage over the world's largest economic bloc?
If Europe no longer relies on your security system, do they still answer your phone calls when a global crisis erupts?
It is arguably the defining geopolitical question of this century, and the answer will be written by the industrial and political choices made in the aftermath of this summit. Just a quick reminder, as we conclude our analysis of the Ankara Summit and the shifting dynamics of global security, we are examining these highly complex issues, from the U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict to the war in Ukraine and the intense debates over defense procurement, strictly through the objective lens of the geopolitical source material provided.
We are not drawing any conclusions about who is right, who is wrong, or what the ultimate moral or policy outcome should be.
We are strictly mapping out the strategic perspectives and operational realities as they exist on the ground today.
The geopolitical landscape remains highly volatile, and the actions of all the state actors involved are deeply rooted in their own perceived strategic imperatives and survival mechanisms.
And that wraps up our discussion for today. Browse our show for more global insights and subscribe so you don't miss the next shift. See you next time on the Commute Commentary.